Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving back into the plates of brass, specifically looking at the prophetic writings attributed to Zenos. Now this text has a really interesting structure. You have the first 10 chapters filled with these intense, very symbolic visions, lots of celestial history, esoteric language, Kabbalistic references. But then chapters 11 and 12, they pivot pretty sharply into these, much more accessible allegories. The parable of the olive tree and the parable of the banquet.
Right, and that pivot, that structural shift, is exactly where the interpretive challenge lies, I think. It really makes you ask about the whole purpose, the intended use of the work itself.
Exactly. So our central question today, the core of our debate, is this. Do those final parables, chapters 11 and 12, actually serve as the definitive explanation for all that dense symbolism we see in the first 10 chapters? And maybe more importantly, does that make the entire text something the, let's say, average religious student can actually access and find useful? Now, I'm going to argue that yes, they absolutely do. The parables are the necessary practical completion of the message.
Okay, and I'm coming at this, from a slightly different angle. My position is that the visions, chapters 1 through 10, are actually explained within those chapters using their own, admittedly, specialized theological language. The explanation culminates by chapter 10. The parables then serve a distinct secondary role. They're more like a powerful sermon, a final ethical warning, which frankly underscores just how complex and specialized the main body of the text really is. It suggests it probably wasn't meant for, widespread lay reading from the get-go.
Okay, I understand that focus on the specialized language itself, but let me frame my position around the idea of, utility. If the whole point of preserving these plates, as chapter 5 kind of suggests, is to be manna to feed Israel in the last days, then surely clarity, ultimate clarity, has to be a goal. Now, the visions, yes, they detail the 7 dispensations, Michael, Zabkiel, Enoch, and so on. But the way they do it is, let's be honest, pretty overwhelming. You've got the 10 Sephirot, the 4 living creatures, Shekinah as the tree of life. For someone just looking for moral guidance or trying to understand the gathering of Israel, that's pretty hard to penetrate.
I don't disagree that the visions are difficult, maybe even impenetrable for many. But I'd argue that difficulty might actually be part of the point I'm making.
Okay, but see, I think the parables perform this really vital act of, let's call it translation. They take the big cosmic story, the war in heaven, Israel's scattering, the final gathering, the judgment, all depicted with some, pretty intense symbolic imagery in the visions, and they render it down into something concrete, relatable, agricultural analogies, social behavior. Take the olive tree parable in chapter 11, all that careful grafting of tame and wild branches. That gives a very straightforward, understandable picture of God's plan to redeem scattered Israel, which was predicted way back in chapter 1, verse 27. That grafting mechanism, it's just far more practical for a lay student than trying to decode, say, the 7 heads of the Leviathan, or the specific meaning of each seal being opened. The parables provide the essential moral core, teshuvah, repentance, diligence, which is surely the ultimate actionable message.
That's a strong case for the practical application, I'll grant you, but I think it kind of sidesteps the text's own internal logic and structure. Let's just look at the command given to Zenos. In chapter 2, the promise isn't, hey, stick around, you'll get a simple allegory later. It's specific. Ye shall see that thou might understand that vision of which thou hast seen. And what follows? Chapters 3 through 10, systematically laying out the 7 angels, the 7 dispensations, seal by seal, vial by vial. The explanation seems quite sequential, quite complete within that visionary framework itself. It's only after the angel literally says, the vision having ended, that the parables begin.
Okay, but couldn't that timing, that placement, after the vision ends, suggest a deliberate shift in mode, precisely for the benefit of the audience? A way to make it stick?
I see it more as signaling a definitive break, a change in subject almost. The primary vision in chapter 1 is just incredibly dense doctrinally. I mean, you have the Son of Man figure described with Sephirot language, clothed from Keter, the divine crown, down to Malchut, the kingdom, holding chesed mercy in one hand and Gevurah, judgment or severity in the other. These are, highly technical concepts about God's very nature and interaction with creation. The parables, they just don't go there. They don't try to simplify Keter or Gevurah. They pivot entirely away from that core metaphysics. It feels less like explanation and more like a powerful but separate sermon kicking in.
I'm still not quite convinced that proves the vision's content, its instruction, was truly complete without the parables. Think about the central and, frankly, quite devastating prediction in that early vision, the destruction and scattering of Israel, right there in chapter 1.27. Now, if the vision just shows the punishment, maybe details the cosmic forces behind it, but doesn't give the practical how for fixing it, the plan for gathering everyone back, is that instruction actually useful? Is it complete for the people, the house of Israel, who desperately need that message?
Well, usefulness in a day-to-day practical sense might be different from theological completeness, wouldn't you say?
But here I think instruction is usefulness. The olive tree parable, chapter 11, that's the practical explanation of how God plans to preserve the root and graft the branches back in. Remember verse 79. That redemptive strategy, that's the overarching story context that, frankly, the violent imagery of seals and vials alone just can't convey in the same way. It gives the mechanism for salvation, framed in a way that allows for human hope and action. Without that, the theological blueprint feels, starkly incomplete, almost just diagnostic without a cure.
Okay, I understand the power of the parable to explain the process of scattering and gathering, but it still doesn't explain the actual symbols of the first 10 chapters, and that's where the accessibility problem remains for the average student. Let's circle back to that specialized terminology for a moment. The visions aren't just using general religious ideas, it's technical stuff. Think about the 4 living creatures that keep appearing with the seals. The lion for judgment, the ox for wisdom, the man for mercy, the eagle for knowledge. These aren't random. They're pretty fixed attributes in that symbolic system. The average student is still left completely adrift trying to understand Chokhmah or Binah, or why the Leviathan's 7 heads are specifically 7 lying tongues or rulers, as chapter 3 explains. The parables, lovely as they are, they abandon that entire specialized language. They don't bridge that gap.
But isn't that abandonment precisely why they're so essential? I'd argue the whole point of the parables is to shift gears, to move beyond the sort of celestial map-making and give people the map for their own conduct, their own spiritual journey. They're like the coat of many colors mentioned, a practical teaching tool, using familiar imagery, the vineyard, which chapter 5 even calls the straight path to Yahweh Elohim. For the average person reading this, knowing how to actually do teshuvah, that real spiritual turning back to God through repentance and changing your ways, that's got to be far more critical, far more useful than mapping the 7 stars coming from the Son of Man's mouth in chapter 7.
I absolutely agree. The moral instruction is vital. And the parable of the banquet in chapter 12 really drives home that message about diligence, being prepared, washing your garments, standing ready. Can't argue with that. But if the ultimate goal is this kind of universal accessibility you're suggesting, why does the text itself seem to lean into such specific, almost restricted origins and transmission?
Restricted? What exactly do you mean by restricted there?
Well, I mean, the source material itself seems to signal a limited audience, doesn't it? The introduction explicitly says the text was put on brass plates in Egyptian because it was not for all of the tribes. That wording seems pretty direct. And then there's the whole translation process described. It's incredibly complex. A meditative state, comparing 3 different layers of writing, Egyptian symbols, unpointed Hebrew, English letters. If the very process of getting the text is that specialized, and the text itself says its audience is limited, how can 2 concluding allegories just magically flip a switch and make the whole thing universally accessible? It feels like the complexity is baked in, maybe intentionally, suggesting it was always aimed at a more, shall we say, advanced or initiated reader.
That's a fair point, a compelling challenge about the original form and transmission. But I think we need to distinguish between the delivery mechanism, the brass plates, the complex translation, and the ultimate purpose of the message contained within. The reason given for its preservation to feed Israel during a spiritual famine, as chapter 5 verse 5 puts it. That suggests the final message has to break through that esoteric barrier eventually.
And I see the parables as that prophetic bridge. When Zenos gives direct commands like, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house," in chapter 12, or tells the faithful to keep thy garments clean and stand ready for the day, later in that chapter. I mean, those are clear, practical, universal calls to action. They're aimed at anyone seeking salvation, so the parables function as the universally applicable application of all that specialized prophecy that came before. And that's what makes the whole book profoundly useful in the end. The average student might not be able to map Chesed and Gevurah on a diagram, sure, but they can absolutely understand and heed the call to be diligent in the vineyard.
I'm sorry, I remain unconvinced that the final 2 chapters somehow retroactively neutralize the deliberate, intricate complexity of the first 10. The core doctrinal vision, chapters 1 through 10, it remains highly technical. It's rooted in a very specific and arguably restricted theological tradition. The parables, in my view, function as this incredibly powerful but distinct final call, a concluding sermon urging repentance and readiness. They are not, however, an explanatory key that unlocks the specialized symbolism. They show that while the results of the cosmic drama, the scattering and gathering, can be put simply, the underlying divine structure and theology that dictates those events remains complex, perhaps even esoteric, and likely best understood by those already familiar with its specific interpretive traditions.
So to kind of wrap up my view, while the visions lay down the vast cosmic and theological blueprint across the 7 dispensations, it's the parables that deliver the essential practical know-how, the mechanism for the gathering, the absolute need for teshuvah, the instructions for everyday spiritual diligence. This is what the house of Israel and really any serious religious student needs to actually apply the text's vital message to their lives. It's the application that makes the instruction complete and truly useful.
And I'd reaffirm my position. The parables stand as incredibly potent but separate admonitions. They effectively shift the narrative focus from dense celestial mechanics to urgent moral imperatives. But they don't simplify or decode the complex, technical, and often esoteric symbolism that really characterizes the bulk of the preceding text, those first 10 chapters. The inherent specialized nature of the visions, I believe, restricts the book's deepest utility primarily to those who are already somewhat immersed in its particular interpretive world, regardless of how accessible the final allegories might appear.
What we're left with then is this fascinatingly layered text. You have this intricate cosmic blueprint, followed immediately by very grounded, practical moral instruction. And the ongoing debate, really, is whether that final practical layer is enough to, let's say, democratize the profound but admittedly difficult wisdom embedded in those earlier visions.
Indeed, it highlights the richness of the material. The plates of brass certainly doesn't offer easy answers. It really compels the reader to grapple with the evidence themselves, weighing the deep, inherent complexity of the source against the clear, universal simplicity of its final calls to action.